started so I can get you out of here hopefully well before 8 o'clock. So I can go to bed at 8:15. As Lynn and I were talking about doing this back in the summer, August time, one of the things that quickly jumped into my head was that there are some real distinct parallels between what we do culturally when we celebrate our nation's Thanksgiving and what we do as a church when we celebrate Eucharistia, which is a Greek word which means Thanksgiving.
I'm sorry, I hear a phone ringing.
And as part of that, we have the tradition that we all learned in school. The pilgrims with the black hats and all that stuff from Plymouth Rock going back to 1621. And while that probably has at least a little bit of historic reference, a lot of it is legend and midrash. It's just things that we've shared, and it kind of builds on itself. And before you know it, one teacher says one thing, and then the next one passes it on, and then it just becomes a little bit of a convoluted legend, but still an important one. Because the basis of that whole story was that the people recognized that through mutual support and the help of the outsider, they were able to survive in a hostile environment. And they got together to celebrate, and they shared among different cultures in order to show God that they were thankful for the blessings they received. That's what that original legend of Thanksgiving, that 1621 Plymouth and the Pilgrims one, is about. It didn't get codified, though, until just after the Battle of Gettysburg, when Abraham Lincoln, having recognized after long periods of no Northern victories, that the victory at Gettysburg was hopefully the beginning of the end of that tragic war we know as the U.S. Civil War. But he was always cautious in the fact that he never claimed that God was on his side or on the North side. He simply said we always have to strive to make sure we're on God's side. And so when he proclaimed that first Thanksgiving of November 23rd, 1863, I believe, he did so to recognize that we owe our gratitude to God and to remember those who had died. And that in the midst of struggle and suffering, God's grace still rests with the people. Much like back in that 1621, in the midst of the struggles they had in the wilderness that was the New World, God's love remained with them. Moving that over to our Eucharist, ours is rooted in the Last Supper, where Jesus, on the night before he died, gathered together with his closest friends in order to do two things. To prepare them for the fact that he was going to suffer and die, and also to give them the strength, the instruction, and the transformative nature that they could continue to be his presence in the world. And when we celebrate the Eucharist, we are celebrating the Last Supper. We're not remembering the Last Supper. We're not commemorating the Last Supper. We're at the Last Supper. And that's something that's a pretty powerful reality of what we believe, because Christ's love transcends time. It is not limited by our lifespan or 1,000 years lifespan. His love is eternal. So when we gather together around the family Thanksgiving table that we call an altar in church, we are gathered together with everyone who is part of the church, living and dead. So if you want to gather together with your grandparents or your parents that may have died, perhaps you lost a child, perhaps you lost a spouse, you are never more united with them than in the celebration of Eucharist. We're all gathered around that table. And in the same sense, in that civil understanding of Thanksgiving, where people came together and shared with one another from their excess so that all could join in the feast. When we celebrate the Eucharist, the Last Supper, we bring all of our presence to it. The whole Christ, all of us, all those who have gone before us, the whole Christ offers the whole Christ. We bring ourselves to the altar, not just us, but united with Jesus. We place ourselves upon the altar and then we're given back more than we brought, which is how God does it. The more we give, the more God gives. The more we give, the more God gives. You can't outgive God, so just keep spinning out. That's why we continue to celebrate. Back to the civil celebration of Thanksgiving. It's inclusive. The legend has it that those English settlers that we call pilgrims gathered together with the Native Americans who were there, who had helped them. And they broke bread together, like we just did 15, 20 minutes ago. When we celebrate it, the whole nation celebrates. You might have one or two people that don't, but by and large, the whole nation celebrates. You're Democrat, Republican, Communist, it doesn't matter what you are. We're all united during that time. You don't see a particular lot of political arguments about celebrating Thanksgiving. It's just part of who we are. Perhaps on a deeper level than political parties or the rest of that stuff. As a church, like I just said before, the whole Christ offers the whole Christ. We gather together as the universal church. Absolutely everybody is wanted and welcomed. Pretty powerful stuff. Our nation's Thanksgiving, it's a special meal. It's not an everyday, ordinary meal. People kind of pull out all the stops. And every family has their own special traditions and things that they have. I've heard of croissants today. I have heard of French head cheese today. No, don't knock it till you try it. It's pretty good stuff. And you all have traditions that you bring out. You might only offer them that one time a year, because it's a special thing. Part of that inclusivity, going back to this one though, is that of all the things we do as a nation throughout the year, that's the one time where I think people's generosity sometimes surprises us. I know dozens of times over the years where people who had nowhere to go and weren't necessarily outgoing and people knew a lot about them got invited to Thanksgiving dinner. Because we notice if our neighbors or even some acquaintances have nowhere to go. And we offer them. I've been invited to more Thanksgiving dinners in the last 20-some years than even come. Because people recognize, hey, you need a place to go. It's not the time we want people alone. Just like the Eucharist, nobody's alone. We're all gathered together. On the special meal side, like I said, we do turkey's a kind of a mild example, but we all have traditions. But in the Eucharist, it's the bread broken and it's the cup poured out. Not anything ordinary, except from the ordinary comes the extraordinary. Because like I said, the whole Christ offers the whole Christ. So when we bring the gifts forward at Mass, they are representing each one of us. And if you look in that little plate of hosts, some of them are cracked, some of them are chipped. There's small pieces, there's whole pieces. Doesn't matter. All of that comes together and is transformed by the love of God into the presence of the risen Christ. Not to be stuck in that ordinary becoming extraordinary bread, but to become one with us. The transformation that all of that happens, that we believe ordinary bread and wine become Jesus' body and blood, doesn't end there. That's the beginning. It's to transform you and I into His presence. You are what you eat. It's pretty much what the Eucharist is about. From the civil thing, like I said, it unites us as a nation. Politics are broken down. Even arguments are broken down. The only thing that ever seems to remain consistent anywhere outside of Michigan is, why do we have to watch those Detroit Lions? Right? But around here, we put up with it. It's just part of who we are. And I'll tell you a little story that kind of broke up our family's Thanksgiving one year. Our tradition was, we got up in the morning, got a glass of eggnog, and watched the Detroit Thanksgiving Day Parade.
Oh, yeah.
And my folks would argue, don't put on that stupid Macy's thing from New York, that's cheap stuff. Watch the Detroit Parade. This is what we did. And when I was a little kid, we even went a few times. Then, we'd pack up the car, go a half a mile to my Uncle Joe and Aunt Blanche's house, or they would pack up their car, drive a half a mile, and come to our house. We would start eating dinner early, right around noon, so that those who wished to torture themselves could go get in a recliner on the living room floor and watch the Lions game. Well, one particular year, a buddy of my dad's had extra tickets. So we were given tickets to the game. We were going to my Uncle Joe and Aunt Blanche's house. My mother was not the happiest person you have ever met that day. Because she tried to tell my dad, well, you can't go to the game. And he looked at her like, watch us. And we went, and shockingly they won. But that was the one year Thanksgiving wasn't the same. It was great to be out with my dad. It was great to watch a football game when you're a kid that's like 9 or 10 years old, and all the rest of that stuff. But something was missing for that year, and we never did it again. Because while it can be sometimes a pain in the neck to schlep over to your relative's house or to prepare your house for a house guest, it's still kind of deeply rooted in who we are. Now, the reason why I say that is I think that's the way a lot of people, rightly so, feel when we miss the Eucharist once in a while. Some of the most heartfelt confessions I've had were about missing Mass, but not because it was an obligation, but it's because the people said, I just felt like something was missing in my week. Yeah, something was missing. When we say obligation, we'll put that out of your mind. It's an opportunity. And I think when we miss that opportunity, at least for that short period of time, there's something missing. Just like when we missed our family's Thanksgiving, there's something missing. Again, civilly, that celebration unites us as a nation. Everybody's doing the same thing. Largest travel day in the world is what, the day before Thanksgiving? Bigger than Christmas, bigger than Easter. The Eucharist unites us in Christ. We're all one. With our blemishes and our gifts and everything, we all come together and we're one. Tied together with the civil celebration are special events. I named a couple of them, parades. Watching the Lions or watching the Cowboys, or there's like a bunch of games now. But there's things you do. Some families get together and play cards in the evening after that. For my family, from the time I was 12 until got out of high school, those of us who would deer hunt would meet about 3 o'clock that day. We'd load up in a bunch of vehicles and we'd go up to Caseville and go to my uncle's cabin up there. We'd deer hunt for the next 3 days. And the neatest part of that was I was always the youngest that was in that group, but you got to feel like, as an only child, at least for me, I got to feel like I was part of a bigger family. You could easily recognize it. It was only years later that when my Uncle Joe and my Uncle Tom would disappear for a little while, they were going down to the Bella Vista Inn to have a shot of beer. But it was always a pretty powerful experience. For us in the Eucharist, it's the Sabbath. There's other things going on. It's the Lord's Day. Sometimes it's rest. Sometimes it's quiet reflection and prayer. Sometimes it's visiting friends and neighbors. Sometimes it's just quiet family time and the rest of life and everything seems so chaotic and so overly scheduled, I will argue right now. Hopefully most families keep at least a part of that Sunday for themselves. When I was a kid, I could go out usually maybe after 4 or 5 o'clock on a Sunday, but prior to that, you were home. There were just things, we had supper together as a family, we did all those kind of things. As a church, it's that quiet time for us, and as a nation, it's time for some extra festivities as well. There's something about being bound together as a nation and as a church that gives us our identity. And it can feel as if both of those things are at risk right now. That as a nation we can feel pretty fractured. And sometimes even as a church we can feel a little bit disjointed. But by doing ritual, whether that's sitting around the family Thanksgiving table, or that's gathering around the table of the Eucharist, there is something that cannot be broken. And as long as we allow those rituals to enter into our lives, I don't think we're in that great a danger. That doesn't mean there aren't problems we have to overcome. But it's the rituals that really do hold us together. If you look in the Jewish community, even those folks that call themselves secular Jews that no longer practice faith, still keep up, many of them, the traditions of the faith, because that's what helps unite these people. So things like Thanksgiving, things like the 4th of July from a secular standpoint are pretty important, because even in a fractured world, it can keep us one. And as a church, we got the best one. We've got the Eucharist. And while sometimes it can become rote, it really never should. Because if you had an opportunity to get in a little time transport and go to the Last Supper in the upper room, you wouldn't miss it for the world. I've made the argument, I haven't had to here because a lot of people sit up front, which is amazing. But when you go to a lot of churches that have the bus shape, long liturgical bus, people often don't want to sit in the front. And it was during the last time the Red Wings were in the Stanley Cup final. And I got up before Mass and I said, if anybody was offered front row tickets at the Stanley Cup finals, you'd grab them and be sitting in the front row, happy as a clam. I don't know why no one wants to sit in the front of those. Next week, you'll be surprised how many people are fighting for the front row. It's transforming and transformational. When we celebrate Thanksgiving, even though you hear about Black Friday sales or Cyber Monday sales and all that other thing that's there, even if it's just a little dinky spark, there's gratitude that happens on Thanksgiving Day. I think most people and most families will at least do a little bit of talking about that, things they were grateful for. When I was a little kid, we would have to share something at the table. What were you grateful for the previous year? Just as a reminder that, God's pretty darn good to us. And it's transformational for us in celebrating the Eucharist, is that bit by bit, day by day, step by step, we believe we are being transformed into the risen Christ. None of us are perfect at it until the resurrection on the last day. But we try to get a little bit closer each week. And the Eucharist gives us that nourishment and presence to make those steps. All of these things, both civil Thanksgiving and our church's Thanksgiving, I believe need time to take effect. That when you do something in the immediate, you don't often understand what you just experienced. But as time moves on, all of a sudden, you kind of get some insight. Like the last time you had Thanksgiving with your dad, and he died the next year. You don't realize it at the time, but you're like, wow, I'm really glad you took the time. We all have moments like that. One of the beautiful things I think about the big family Thanksgiving is while it is inclusive, like I said, it's also made to take care of particular needs. Example being, the big people table and the little people table. Both are happier with that separation. Both are included, right? Except I've always more fun at the little table than the big table. I always believe that's the case. What's that? Oh, I thought somebody said that. That's the church is that way. Children's liturgy of the word, right? We're all together, but they're getting some nourishment in a different way because they need a little something different. We're inclusive in that, but sometimes we cater to special needs. Even if you're making different food for somebody who can't eat a certain food, we kind of try to make sure everybody feels at home. Another thing we do is tell stories. We've all got that uncle or aunt or grandfather that tells you a story. And sometimes those stories are repeated year after year after year after year. And they seem, at least to the person telling them, like they're brand new. And you know what? You wouldn't miss them for the world. We've had stories like that. I'm going to transfer to our deer camp because that's kind of like our early Thanksgiving with brother priests I get together with. And those who have died over the years, some of those were some pretty interesting characters. And they would tell stories. Well, we picked up the slack and we tell the same stories they told as if they were our own. Because it's part of the tradition. Well, we do the same at the Eucharist. What do you think the scriptures are? There are family stories. Some of them are very accurate historically. Some of them aren't. They're just trying to teach us a lesson. But we tell them because that's part of who we are. It's our story. In that big cosmos, we have a story that has us where we're at, why we're there, and what time we're there. And it all kind of ties together. Ties together. Eucharist as our life in Christ, the universal church, and Thanksgiving for us as a nation. They're both pretty special, and I don't think we want to give up either one. So when you gather together with your family in a couple days, don't be in a hurry. I've always been the one that I have a strong aversion, in fact it's a phobia, against dirty dishes. So I will get up and start doing, I hate doing dishes, but I can't stand them in the sink. So I'll just start doing, you'll be eating, give me your plate, I'll take it. It's a mistake, don't do that. Listen to the stories, the dishes will eventually get done. Pay particular attention to your elders who are gathered around. Because that's where your roots are at. And those are the traditions that are handed on to you. You want to hand them on to your kids and grandkids. And that's the only way it happens, is when we pay attention. Just like the church. We all are handed our faith, virtually all of us, by our parents or our grandparents. And our parents who teach us our prayers before we go to bed. Or our grandmother who makes sure we get to faith formation classes. We're dependent upon one another, and both in the Eucharist and in some of our civil, secular celebrations, we need to hang on to that tradition.